1941. The Pacific is a Japanese lake. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, the rising sun dominates every horizon. Battleships steam with confidence. Carriers glide across open seas like floating fortresses. In Tokyo, the admirals of the Imperial Navy stand at the height of their power, drunk on victory and myth. At naval banquets, they laugh at reports of American submarines. Their boats are toys, one scoffs, too slow to strike, too blind to hunt. The Imperial Navy, raised on surface warfare and decisive battles, sees submarines as little more than mechanical curiosities, beneath honor, beneath strategy, beneath notice. The laughter becomes doctrine. Across the Pacific, the Americans do little to change that impression. Their first patrols limp home in silence. Torpedoes strike steel and fail to explode. Targets escape unscathed. The Mark 14, the weapon meant to deliver vengeance, instead becomes a symbol of failure. Commanders write reports filled with shame, not glory. For every ship that sinks, 3 escape untouched. Even the ocean seems to conspire against them. In Washington, excuses drown out reason. Bureaucrats blame crews, not weapons. Operator error, they insist. Behind closed doors, young submarine captains curse quietly, knowing the truth, that the tools they've been given are unfit for war. The silent service, as it is called, becomes a fleet not of heroes but of ghosts, patrolling without recognition, striking without result. And yet, in the dark corners of Pearl Harbor and Brisbane, something begins to change. Engineers tinker after hours. Sailors strip torpedoes open on the docks. Commanders rewrite attack tactics, searching for a method the manuals never taught. In the quiet between failures, they learn patience, and resentment hardens into resolve. The Japanese see none of this. From their island empire, they look out across an ocean they believe they own. Convoys move unescorted. Tankers sail in confidence. Beneath them, however, in the black depths, where sound travels farther than light, steel hulls wait, silent, wounded but listening. The admirals may have mocked the Americans for their weakness, but war is a patient teacher. The laughter still echoes across the Pacific, unaware that beneath the waves, redemption is already stirring. Pearl Harbor burns. Battleships lie broken in the shallows, their hulls twisted like metal carcasses. Smoke climbs into the morning sky, and the pride of the U.S. Navy sinks beneath its own harbor. Yet amid the wreckage, one small corner of the base remains untouched: the submarine pens, silent, shadowed, and ignored. The men of the silent service stare across the water, surrounded by chaos but spared from it. Their boats survived, but their faith did not. When war comes, they are told to strike back, to bring the fight beneath the surface, where no fleet can reach them. But few realize that the submarines are armed with a secret enemy of their own. It is called the Mark 14 torpedo, a marvel on paper, a disaster in reality. It runs too deep, it fails to explode, and when it does, it often circles back to strike the very boat that fired it. Commanders write reports filled with disbelief. 2 hits heard, no explosions, target escaped. Again and again, their prey sails away untouched, while the ocean swallows the proof. Crews begin to doubt themselves. Did they aim wrong, fire too early, miss their chance? In Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance insists the fault lies not in design, but in discipline. Engineers in clean offices blame sailors sweating inside steel tubes. Operator error, they repeat. Pride blinds reason. Bureaucracy deafens truth. Meanwhile, the Japanese merchant fleet sails untouched across an empire stretching from Burma to the Solomons. Tankers carry oil to Nagasaki. Freighters deliver rice to Tokyo. Admirals in Tokyo laugh, their confidence reinforced. They call American submarines blind moles, and for now, the insult fits. For the men aboard those subs, each patrol becomes an act of endurance rather than vengeance. They drift through enemy waters, listening to the hum of convoys they cannot stop. Their torpedoes, their very teeth, are rotten. Some boats vanish without trace, others return with tales of failure so absurd they border on tragedy. And yet, in the long nights beneath the sea, something unspoken forms among them, a stubborn refusal to accept humiliation. They know the weapon is broken, but their will is not. Somewhere in those dimly lit control rooms, a thought begins to take shape. If the tools are wrong, they will make their own. Above them, Japanese officers toast another victory. Below them, men of the silent service reload their torpedo tubes and try again. The ocean offers no sympathy, but it rewards persistence. The Americans are not yet feared, not yet respected, but beneath the waves, they are learning how to strike back. In 1942, the Pacific was still a Japanese sea. Convoys moved unchallenged across its vast blue empire. And American submarines, the so-called silent service, seemed destined to remain silent forever. The weapons failed, the orders were cautious, and faith was running thin. But inside that quiet humiliation, a few men began to rebel. They were young skippers, brash, restless, unwilling to accept that defeat was mechanical destiny. Names like Dudley "Mush" Morton, Richard O'Kane, Eugene Fluckey, men who would soon become legends, whispered across the wardrooms of the Pacific. They ignored caution, rewrote tactics, and dared to question the very machines that betrayed them. In their cramped steel hulls, these officers turned submarines into laboratories. Torpedoes were dismantled piece by piece, detonators examined under dim red lights. Engineers worked through the night, adjusting depth regulators by hand. Sailors became inventors, marking each adjustment not in theory, but in risk. One mistake could send a boat and its crew into permanent silence. When bureaucrats dismissed their reports, the skippers tested anyway. Some fired live torpedoes against coral cliffs to prove the truth. Others risked court-martial to force the Navy to listen. The lessons were learned not from manuals, but from men who died trying. Every malfunction had a name. Every success had a cost. But beneath the weight of failure, something else began to take shape. A new kind of brotherhood. The submarine crews, isolated from headlines and parades, developed a loyalty bound by shared danger and innovation. They learned to think beyond regulation, to rely on instinct when doctrine failed. The ocean was unforgiving, but it was also honest. Patience became their greatest weapon. Each patrol was a test of endurance, waiting in darkness for convoys that might never come, listening to sonar pings that echoed like heartbeats. The submariners grew used to uncertainty. They stopped expecting orders to save them and started solving the war themselves. What began as a collection of broken boats was slowly transforming into a thinking weapon, guided not by command, but by conviction. Pride, once wounded by failure, hardened into purpose. The men who refused to quit were no longer fighting for glory. They were fighting for competence, for the right to prove that the laughter in Tokyo had been premature. And far out in the Pacific, beneath the surface where pride cannot breathe, their resolve was beginning to surface. In 1942, Japan's empire stretched from Burma to the Solomons, a vast crescent of conquest sustained by a single fragile thread, its sea lanes. Every bullet fired in the Pacific, every drop of aviation fuel in its tanks, every handful of rice in its barracks had crossed the ocean. The empire's heart did not beat on land. It pulsed across the waves. Yet in Tokyo, few saw danger beneath the surface. The admirals of the combined fleet still believed wars were won by battleships and courage, not by commerce and convoys. The submarine threat, they said, belonged to another kind of war, one they did not expect to fight. And so Japan's lifeline stretched thin, unguarded, and overconfident across an ocean that was slowly turning hostile. In Hawaii and Australia, American codebreakers began to listen. Through 1,000 intercepted messages and fragments of naval traffic, the outlines of Japan's empire came into focus: merchant lanes, refueling points, and schedules. From that invisible map, the hunters plotted their approach. The submarines Wahoo, Tang, Trigger, and Silversides slipped into position, patient and unseen. The first victories were small, a lone freighter here, a transport there. Yet each success carried lessons. Attacks once made in daylight now came at night. Commanders learned to use radar like a blind man's cane, striking through fog and moonlight. Where earlier patrols had failed, the new captains trusted instinct over procedure. They began to understand that the ocean itself could be a weapon. Its silence, their camouflage, its vastness, their ally. When Wahoo, under Dudley "Mush" Morton, sank an entire convoy in one patrol, Tokyo dismissed it as coincidence. Luck, the Admiralty said. American propaganda. But luck does not repeat itself. By 1943, American submarines were attacking in pairs, then in coordinated wolf packs. Convoys once left port with banners. Now they sailed under curfew and fear. Each engagement grew more methodical. Torpedo spreads were calculated by rhythm, not guesswork. The submariners had learned to read the sea, to sense when a target zigged or panicked, when escorts broke formation, when sonar pings meant confidence or desperation. The learning curve that began in humiliation was turning into doctrine. Japanese officers began to notice the silence. Ships that never arrived, ports that waited for oil that never came. Yet even then, denial prevailed. Reports were rewritten to preserve pride. Storms at sea, enemy aircraft, unexplained loss. But the truth was surfacing. Beneath their empire, an invisible war was already consuming its arteries. Each submarine became an ecosystem of endurance. Men sealed in steel for weeks, hunting by sound, living on discipline and chance. They stalked tankers through black water, firing torpedoes at echoes, then diving to escape depth charges that fell like steel rain. Every patrol was a study in patience. One mistake, and the hunter became the hunted. The Japanese called these attacks dishonorable, the work of cowards who struck unseen. The Americans called it arithmetic. For every freighter that burned, the empire grew hungrier. For every tanker that vanished, an airbase went dry. What began as isolated strikes was becoming a campaign of strangulation, one that would not end with a single decisive battle, but with silence. And somewhere in the dark, the men who had once been dismissed as blind moles were learning how to suffocate an empire. War turned the Pacific into a vast laboratory of suffering and invention. Every patrol was a lesson written in fear, sweat, and salt water. For the men of the silent service, the ocean became both teacher and tormentor, an endless classroom where the price of knowledge was often life itself. Inside the steel hull of a submarine, space was measured in inches. Men slept beside torpedoes, their bunks wedged between engines that never stopped humming. Air grew heavy with oil, humidity, and carbon dioxide. In the heat of the equator, temperatures climbed past 120 degrees. Water dripped from the ceilings. Every breath felt borrowed. Yet even in that furnace of confinement, discipline held the crew together, a rhythm of duty that replaced comfort. When the boat submerged, silence ruled. Each ping of sonar was both a warning and a prayer. Depth charges fell like thunderbolts. turning the sea into a hammer that struck from every direction. Bolts screamed, lights flickered, and the hull bent with the weight of the deep. Veterans later said that no man ever truly breathed until the explosions stopped. Fear in such moments did not vanish. It simply became familiar. Every dive, every escape, taught something. Skippers learned the subtle art of deception, firing, diving, drifting, and then rising behind their own bubbles to strike again. They experimented with radar tracking, creeping up on convoys through storms, using darkness as armor. Submarines once built to hide began to hunt on the surface at night, engines roaring black smoke against the moonlight. The Japanese, blind to this new method, called it madness. In reality, it was mastery. The ocean became a tutor more honest than any admiral. A faulty maneuver meant a steel coffin. A good decision meant survival and another chance to refine the craft. Engineers back at Pearl Harbor gathered each returning crew's reports like sacred scripture, analyzing speed, sonar echoes, torpedo angles, turning instinct into doctrine. From chaos emerged a pattern. From isolation, strategy. The submariners learned to think like predators, not soldiers. Patience was their weapon now. They could wait for hours, days even, motionless in the dark, tracking the faint rhythm of a ship's propeller far beyond the horizon. When they struck, it was with precision born from repetition. One torpedo to cripple, another to confirm, a third to erase. And slowly, the laughter in Tokyo began to fade. Japanese convoys, once sailing with confidence, now traveled in fear. Ships zigzagged, scattered, or simply stayed in port. But beneath those victories lay a quiet transformation, a group of men who had learned to turn failure into innovation, who had mastered the impossible art of surviving the deep. By the end of 1943, the Silent Service was no longer learning how to fight. It was teaching the world a new kind of warfare, unseen, patient, relentless. The submarine had become more than a machine. It was now a philosophy of endurance. The fleet once mocked for blindness had found its vision, not in light, but in darkness. By 1943, the Pacific War had settled into a strange rhythm, one of courage restrained by failure. American submarines prowled the seas with precision, only to watch their torpedoes strike true and then float harmlessly to the surface. Entire patrols returned empty-handed, haunted by the sound of explosions that never came. The men had done everything right, and still nothing worked. The ocean did not forgive excuses. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Charles Lockwood had heard enough reports of failure to recognize a pattern too painful to ignore. Something was wrong, not with the crews, but with the weapons themselves. The Mark 14 torpedo, the Navy's supposed masterpiece, was betraying those who fired it. On paper, it was perfect, advanced, precise, equipped with both contact and magnetic detonators. In reality, it was a threefold disaster, running too deep, detonating too early, or not at all. For 2 years, bureaucracy had dismissed the warnings. Washington blamed inexperience, poor aim, anything but the weapon. The torpedo is sound, officials insisted. The fault lies with the men. But the men were dying to prove otherwise. Lockwood, himself a submariner, decided to end the argument with evidence no admiral could ignore. In the summer of 1943, on the cliffs of Kahulawe, Hawaii, Lockwood ordered live-fire tests. Torpedoes were aimed not at enemies, but at rock. When the explosions failed to appear, the truth could no longer be buried. Depth-keeping mechanisms were off by as much as 10 feet. Magnetic detonators were triggering too early. Contact fuses failed when striking at perfect angles. The very accuracy crews had trained for was sabotaging them. The sight of torpedoes slamming harmlessly into stone became a revelation and an indictment. Years of overconfidence, of untested assumptions and bureaucratic pride had nearly cost America the Pacific. In a single afternoon, the Silent Service's shame turned to fury, and then to purpose. Lockwood scrapped the faulty magnetic detonators, ordered new depth calibrations, and demanded field testing on every modification. For the first time, the Navy listened to its submariners. The men who had been doubted were now shaping doctrine with hard-won authority. What began as rebellion was becoming reform. That year, the results spoke louder than any report. Successful attacks doubled. Convoys that had once crossed safely from the Dutch East Indies began to vanish without a trace. Tankers burned in the South China Sea, their flames visible for miles across the black horizon. Crews reported explosions so powerful they shook the sea like earthquakes. The silence that had mocked the submarines was now filled with the echo of their success. In Tokyo, confusion replaced laughter. Japanese commanders could not explain how American submarines, once so ineffective they were barely acknowledged, had suddenly become lethal. The Imperial Navy increased its escorts, rerouted convoys, and even attempted decoys. None of it worked. The hunters had learned too well, and now their weapons obeyed. For the men who had endured years of humiliation, the first confirmed sinkings were more than victory. They were vindication. The Wahoo, Trigger, Silversides, and Tang became symbols of what persistence could achieve when faith in truth outweighed faith in hierarchy. Each torpedo fired carried not just explosive power, but moral force, proof that reason, when pursued stubbornly enough, could correct even the failings of an empire. In the months that followed, the Pacific began to shift. Supply lines once thought eternal grew thin. Japan's oil reserves dwindled, its factories slowed. The sea, once their fortress, was becoming a prison. What had started as an act of defiance had turned into a revolution beneath the waves, and in that moment, the empire that had laughed learned the cost of underestimating persistence, one explosion at a time. By late 1943, the silence of the Pacific had changed its meaning. What once echoed with the confidence of an empire now concealed an invisible predator. The American submarine fleet, once humiliated, once doubted, now moved with precision through Japan's arteries of supply. The hunters had learned their trade. The ocean that hid them now obeyed them. Radar had rewritten the rules. No longer did commanders rely on the moon or luck. They saw convoys long before the enemy knew they were near. Torpedoes, once unreliable, now struck with mathematical certainty. Wolfpack tactics, borrowed from German doctrine and refined through American patience, turned isolated boats into coordinated ambushes. The Pacific was vast, but nowhere vast enough to hide Japan's lifelines. In the Luzon Strait, Wahoo under Mush Morton attacked an entire convoy in one night. 8 ships went down before dawn. Flames climbed skyward, painting the sea orange and gold. In those burning reflections, the submariners saw more than destruction. They saw the reversal of fortune. Each sinking was not vengeance, but verification. The system worked. What had been broken was now weaponized. Soon came Tang, under Richard O'Kane, a name that would become synonymous with fear to Japanese sailors. Patrol after patrol, Tang shattered records, striking with surgical precision, vanishing before retaliation. Its crew spoke of the ocean as if it were alive, a breathing, waiting ally that whispered through sonar and radar alike. "We hunted in silence," O'Kane later wrote, "and the sea delivered." The Japanese High Command, blind to the true scope of loss, continued to measure victory in tonnage sunk by their own forces, not tonnage lost to the enemy. Reports of missing ships were buried beneath optimism. It was easier to blame weather than to admit a new enemy had mastered invisibility, but numbers do not lie forever. Oil shipments began to dwindle. Factories that once thrived on steady flow now stalled. The Empire's machines, its planes, its very mobility began to fade. Every submarine patrol became both mission and experiment. Skippers refined attack patterns, striking from beneath thermoclines where sonar could not reach. They used moonlight as camouflage, radar as instinct, and mathematics as prophecy. These were no longer sailors, they were engineers of disappearance. Their victories were measured not by explosions, but by what never arrived. By the end of 1943, 1 in every 3 Japanese merchant ships lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Still, Tokyo refused to grasp the scale of the catastrophe. The Imperial Navy had been built to fight grand battles, fleets meeting in daylight, guns thundering in ceremony. Now it was dying quietly, one convoy at a time, in darkness. American skippers began to sense the larger truth. They were no longer just destroying ships. They were dismantling an empire. Every tanker sunk meant another airfield silent, another army stranded. Islands once fortified with confidence began to starve, cut off from oil and ammunition. The strategy was elegant in its cruelty, not annihilation, but suffocation. For the men who lived inside steel coffins, that realization was both victory and burden. Each patrol meant fewer enemies above, and more ghosts below. Success came measured in silence, in the absence of sound, where ships once moved freely. As 1944 approached, Japan's admirals convened in disbelief. Their convoys, once the empire's arteries, had become its wounds. They began to understand too late what had already been decided beneath the surface, that the war's outcome no longer depended on battleships or bombers, but on the patience of men unseen. The empire that ruled the waves was now being drowned by the quiet it once ignored. January 1944. The war at sea had entered a new season, one defined not by battleships, but by disappearance. From Singapore, Convoy 312 set out under the rising sun, a fragile procession of tankers, freighters, and escorts carrying oil, rice, and the illusion of safety. On board, sailors whispered that the worst of the submarine threat was over. The Imperial Navy had promised tighter protection, stronger discipline, but the ocean listens to no promises. Northward through the Luzon Strait, the convoy moved into waters that looked calm, but were anything but empty. Beneath them, in the black depths, 3 American submarines, Parch, Seahorse, and Skate, waited in patient silence. Their radar screens pulsed faintly in the dark, each blip a heartbeat of the enemy. The men inside spoke little. They had rehearsed this moment too many times to need words. At midnight, contact was confirmed. The order came in a whisper. Fire 1! A streak of compressed air, a distant tremor, then an eruption of fire that tore the night in half. Within seconds, a second torpedo found its mark, then a third. Flames rolled across the waves, climbing high enough to illuminate the mountains of Luzon. The oil tankers, once symbols of Japan's reach, became pyres drifting on their own cargo. From the periscopes, the American commanders watched in silence. They could see men clinging to debris, the flicker of signal lamps, the silhouettes of escorts turning wildly in confusion. It was over in minutes. Convoy 312 ceased to exist, swallowed by the very sea that was meant to protect it. Hours later, a second group of ships, following the same route, met the same fate. The Japanese escorts, already exhausted, chased phantoms across the radar screens. Torpedoes came from everywhere and nowhere. Each explosion was followed by silence, the kind that carries the weight of finality. At dawn, the Luzon Strait was a graveyard. Oil spread in thin, iridescent sheets across the surface, reflecting the sunrise in colors too beautiful for what they covered. The survivors drifted among charred beams and lifeless cargo, calling out to ships that were already gone. "Where is the convoy?" one radioman signaled to Manila. The answer, unspoken, was everywhere and nowhere. For the first time, Japanese commanders grasped the magnitude of their loss. The Empire's arteries, the routes that fed its soldiers, fueled its planes, sustained its ambition, had been cut. The Pacific, once a highway of resources, was turning into a desert. News of Convoy 3's destruction traveled slowly, censored to protect morale. But among sailors, the truth spread faster than any communique. The name became a warning whispered in wardrooms and dockyards. Beware the Luzon Strait. What they feared most was not the submarines themselves, but the realization that they were invisible and unstoppable. In Washington, Admiral Lockwood read the decrypted reports and said simply, "This is the turning tide." The silent service had reached its full maturity. After years of trial, error, and loss, its men had rewritten the laws of naval warfare. 3 boats had undone months of Japanese logistics, and with them, a portion of the Empire's faith in itself. The Pacific that once carried empire now carried ghosts. Ships that left port with banners and prayers would never arrive. Each sunken convoy meant fewer tanks in Burma, fewer planes over the Philippines, fewer rations for garrisons across the Pacific chain. The war was no longer a contest of armies, but of endurance, and Japan's was running out. In Tokyo, admirals ordered new convoys, new escorts, new hope. But hope is not buoyant. The Empire could build ships faster than it could fill them, and the ocean's hunters were already waiting. In the Luzon Strait, the water still burned at night, the sea itself marking the moment Japan began to die. By mid-1944, the Pacific Ocean, once the beating heart of Japan's empire, had fallen strangely quiet. Convoys that once stretched from Singapore to Yokohama now sailed in fragments, or not at all. Merchant ships left port under radio silence, running zigzag courses through darkness, hoping the sea itself might show mercy. It did not. The hunters were everywhere, and the ocean had turned against its master. American submarines now ruled beneath the waves, with radar, sonar, and new torpedoes that rarely missed. They struck not in anger, but with cold precision. Each patrol mapped the Empire's collapse in tonnage lost. Tankers, freighters, transports, all disappearing into the depths. What had begun as scattered success had become systematic annihilation. By the summer of that year, more than half of Japan's merchant fleet lay at the bottom of the Pacific. The numbers told a story too vast to comprehend. 4.8 million tons sunk. Month after month, the arteries of empire severed one ship at a time. Factories that once roared with production fell silent for lack of fuel and metal. Assembly lines stood frozen, workers idle beside cold machines. The empire could still fight, but it could no longer move. In naval headquarters, the reports grew desperate. Destroyer captains begged for fuel to train their crews. Tankers were too few to deliver it. Fighter pilots rationed aviation fuel, saving every drop for a defense that would never come. Even training flights ceased. "We cannot fight," one admiral wrote bitterly, "if we cannot move." Across the cities, scarcity became the new enemy. Rice rations shrank to a handful per day. Lamps burned low or not at all. Civilians queued for hours for fish that never arrived. The war had entered every kitchen, every bowl, every silence after sunset. And still, Tokyo censored the truth. Newspapers printed victories that no longer existed. Speeches spoke of faith instead of facts. The people were told to endure. Endurance, however, cannot feed an army. For the submariners of the U.S. Silent Service, the victory they were building was unseen, almost abstract. They did not see the factories go dark or the soldiers go hungry. They saw only the periscope image of a ship, small, distant, unaware, and the white trail of a torpedo that would end it. They were writing history, one detonation at a time, buried in the noise of sonar pings and the hiss of compressed air. Yet even as their success mounted, unease settled among them. Some wondered about the unseen cost, not in ships, but in souls. To wage war by absence, to win by starvation, carried a quiet weight. Still, they sailed on. The war demanded nothing less. By autumn, Japan's seas had become deserts. The once busy routes of the East China Sea and the South China Sea now lay littered with wrecks. Fishing boats dared not venture out. Merchantmen hugged the coastlines, hunted by radar even in fog. Silence, once the submariner's ally, had become Japan's curse. Tokyo's war planners met in rooms where maps told the truth no speech could hide. The empire that had laughed at American weakness was now dying from American persistence. An industrial war fought not with spectacle, but with mathematics. One torpedo equaled a ship. One ship equaled 1,000 empty stomachs. The equation was merciless, and it was working. By the year's end, even the admirals understood. Their fleet was still afloat, their soldiers still armed, but their lifeline had vanished beneath the waves. They had lost not to superior numbers, but to endurance, ingenuity, and a nation that refused to stay broken. In 1941, Japan had owned the ocean. By 1944, the ocean itself had turned against them, and silence had become the sound of defeat. For every Japanese convoy that vanished beneath the waves, an American submarine paid the ocean's price. 1 out of every 5 submariners would never return, the highest casualty rate in the U.S. Navy. They called it the Silent Service, not just for secrecy, but for the silence that followed so many names. Inside those steel hulls, there was no glamour, no spectacle, only pressure, sweat, and the constant nearness of death. A submarine was both weapon and coffin, sealed against the sea by inches of metal. When the depth charges came, there was nowhere to run. Men sat motionless in the red glow of emergency lamps, counting seconds between explosions. Each detonation bent steel and bone alike. The air turned thick with diesel and fear. Paint peeled from the walls in flakes. Sweat dripped from every surface. Gauges trembled, rivets groaned, bulkheads flexed. In that crushing silence between blasts, men could hear the ocean pressing, a reminder that nature itself was waiting to claim them. Some whispered prayers, others stared at the depth gauge, willing it to stop climbing. Many boats never surfaced again. Some vanished mid-patrol, their last transmission a set of coordinates or a quiet enemy sighted. For weeks afterward, families waited for word that never came. In naval headquarters, the reports were brief, overdue and presumed lost. A line of type followed by silence. Still, the crews kept sailing. Each new patrol carried the knowledge that survival was luck, not guarantee. Yet they went willingly, not out of bravado, but belief. Every torpedo fired, every convoy destroyed meant fewer men dying on beaches or in bombed cities above. It was a grim arithmetic that only the ocean could balance. They developed a strange intimacy with danger. Veterans spoke of how the ocean changed them, how after a while fear became rhythm. The ping of sonar, the hiss of air, the thud of closing hatches. These sounds became music of endurance. Some skippers joked in whispers to steady their crews. Others kept a photo pinned to the periscope, a reminder of what waited beyond the sea. For the submariners, heroism was not loud. It was not in medals or speeches, but in repetition, one dive after another, one more patrol when logic said enough. Their victories were invisible, their deaths often unknown, yet they kept the Pacific in check, unseen and unheard, until the empire above them began to collapse. When survivors returned to Pearl Harbor or Fremantle, they looked unchanged to outsiders, lean, quiet men with hollow eyes and nervous hands. But they had lived weeks without sunlight, months without safety. Their humor was dry, their camaraderie unspoken. They had looked into the abyss and found purpose there. By the end of the war, 52 American submarines were lost, 3,500 men gone to the deep. No graves, no crosses, no return. Only names etched on memorial walls and coordinates marking where steel met salt and silence. The ocean had taken them, but their work endured. Each patrol had been more than a mission. It was a vow that their struggle, hidden beneath the waves, would shorten the agony above. Every loss at depth carried meaning at the surface. Every life given below brought another spared ashore. In the final years of the Pacific War, courage was not measured in sound or ceremony. It was measured in silence, the kind that only the deep can keep. By late 1944, the Pacific had grown eerily still. The sea that once carried the pulse of an empire now held only the echoes of what had been. Japan's merchant fleet, the veins through which its war machine once pumped life, was gone. Ships that had carried oil, food, and steel now lay twisted beneath the waves. Convoys no longer steamed in proud formation. They crept, scattered and terrified, through oceans that had turned against them. Destroyers, once the protectors of empire, now guarded nothing but absence. They steamed for days without contact, escorting empty horizons. Officers stared at radar screens that showed nothing but static. The enemy, it seemed, had dissolved into the deep. And yet, in that void, death waited, patient and precise. The American submarines, once dismissed as slow and blind, now prowled the seas like silent predators. No longer satisfied with merchant ships, they turned their sights on the giants, the warships that once symbolized Japanese supremacy. In November 1944, the submarine Archerfish found its greatest prize. Beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea sailed Shinano, the world's largest aircraft carrier, newly built and barely tested. Within minutes, 6 torpedoes struck her hull. Hours later, she rolled and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. She was not alone. The submarines Albacore and Kavala had already sent the carriers Taiho and Shokaku to the bottom. Each sinking carried more than tactical weight. It was symbolic. The floating palaces that once dominated the Pacific were dying not in grand fleet actions, but in quiet ambushes, by weapons fired from unseen depths. Pride was being dismantled by persistence. In Tokyo, the admirals who once mocked the American moles signed orders tinged with desperation. They commanded convoys to halt, fleets to anchor, and ships to remain in port until the submarine situation stabilizes. But the ocean no longer obeyed them. Every harbor felt like a trap, every journey a suicide. The Imperial Navy had been built for glory. Decisive battles, thunderous broadsides, banners against the sky. But this new war had no pageantry, no warning, no sound. The sea itself had changed sides. For every submarine sunk, 10 more emerged. For every convoy lost, the Empire lost another breath of life. By winter, fuel reserves had dwindled to nothing. The mighty battleships Yamato and Musashi, emblems of imperial strength, sat immobilized, too precious to move, too powerless to matter. Even the planes that defended Tokyo could barely leave the ground. The empire that had begun its conquest by sea was now imprisoned by it. In naval schools, young cadets studied outdated charts and obsolete tactics. They trained for battles that would never happen. Outside their classrooms, the war was already decided, not by strategy, but by attrition. America's submarines had achieved what no bombing raid or invasion yet could. They had starved the empire into submission. Still, Tokyo refused to admit defeat. Official communiques spoke of temporary disruptions and strategic regrouping. But the sailors knew better. They could see the truth in their empty harbors, their silent radios, their fuel-starved engines. The Pacific, once alive with movement, now seemed to hold its breath. And beneath that stillness, the submarines continued their work, unseen, uncelebrated, and unstoppable. By the end of 1944, Japan's sea lanes had ceased to exist. Its navy still had ships, but not purpose. Its admirals still had ranks, but not control. What began as mockery had ended in annihilation. The empire that once laughed at the toys of its enemy now drifted toward ruin, undone not by explosions above, but by silence below. By 1945, Japan's empire was still standing, but it was hollow. The cause was not a single battle, nor a great bombardment, but an absence. The tankers that once fed its armies, its aircraft, its cities, were gone. Beneath the calm surface of the Pacific, an invisible blockade had already done what fleets and firebombs could not. Oil, the black blood of modern war, had vanished. Without it, the empire's veins ran dry. Army divisions sat stranded on islands they could no longer defend. Trucks rusted where they stood. Aircraft, polished and ready, never left their hangars. Pilots trained in silence, their planes grounded not by defeat in the air, but by emptiness in their fuel tanks. Factories that had once poured steel and munitions into the war machine now flickered in darkness. Power was rationed hour by hour. Machines stood cold while workers waited for current that would not come. In Tokyo, the trams ran once a week, a gesture more symbolic than useful, as if movement itself could defy exhaustion. The effect rippled through every level of life. Civilians lined up for kerosene that never arrived, for lamps that would never burn. Housewives boiled rice over wood fires. Students walked miles to schools lit by candles. In a nation that had built its empire upon mastery of the sea had turned traitor. The submarines that had done this work were few, barely 2% of the U.S. Navy's manpower, yet their reach was total. They did not need to invade or occupy, they simply waited. They hunted not soldiers, but the lifelines that sustained them. In that patience lay their power. One torpedo at a time, they had drained the Pacific of movement, until the empire itself became a prisoner of geography. Inside Japan, the truth was whispered, never printed. Government reports spoke of temporary shortages, of transport difficulties, but even the highest councils knew the empire's defeat had already been written beneath the water months before surrender. Every unlit lamp, every silent engine, every grounded aircraft was proof that the war was over, even if no one could yet say it aloud. Historians would later call it the Invisible War, a campaign waged not in battles, but in equations. For every ton of oil lost, a factory slowed. For every ship sunk, another city went dark. The submarines had become the empire's shadow, unseen but inescapable, suffocating it without ever touching its shores. Tokyo's streets, once filled with parades of victory, now echoed with bicycles and wooden carts. The engines that had powered conquest had gone silent. And still, officials spoke of honor, of destiny, of spirit. But spirit could not move a tank, and destiny could not light a city. In 1941, Japanese admirals had laughed at American submarines. Slow, fragile, and few. 4 years later, those same submarines had erased an empire's ability to move, to build, to fight. The laughter had become silence, and silence had become surrender. The empire had not been burned from above, it had been strangled from below. The mockery of 1941 now read like prophecy, undone. August 1945. The guns fell quiet, and the Pacific exhaled. Japan had surrendered. Across the ocean, American submarines rose one by one from the deep, surfacing into peace for the first time in 4 long years. Their decks, scarred and rusted, caught the morning light. Men emerged blinking into air that no longer smelled of war. There were no bands waiting, no parades, no fanfare. The submariners of the Pacific slipped back into port with the same silence that had defined their war. They had fought in shadows, unseen even by their own countrymen. Where others had conquered by fire and spectacle, they had conquered by patience. Their victory was invisible. No captured cities, no dramatic flags over rubble, only the absence of ships, the quiet collapse of an empire that could no longer move. They had starved a nation without setting foot upon its soil. Their war had ended not with explosions, but with stillness. In naval bases from Pearl Harbor to Fremantle, sailors cleaned their boats for the last time. They packed gear into duffels, scrawled names on bulkheads, and left behind the claustrophobic steel that had been both weapon and tomb. For many, it was harder to walk away from the sea than it had been to face it. Historians would later call it the most decisive, unnoticed campaign of the war. In 4 years, fewer than 300 submarines had destroyed over half of Japan's merchant fleet, and more than 1,000 warships. They had done so with minimal recognition, no newspaper headlines, no medals handed in stadiums. Their legacy lived in tonnage charts, in statistics scribbled in the margins of forgotten reports. Even among the Allied forces, few understood the scale of what had been achieved. Submarine warfare was a lonely craft, measured not in glory but endurance. Every success had carried the weight of risk. Every patrol had balanced between genius and disappearance. Yet their enemies understood. In post-war interrogations, Japanese admirals admitted the truth. We never understood their quiet power. The empire that had once ridiculed America's submarines now credited them with Japan's defeat. For the first time, silence had proven mightier than sound. The men of the silent service returned home changed, older, slower, their humor tempered by what they had seen beneath the waves. They spoke little of their missions, less of their losses. Of the 52 submarines that never came back, only coordinates remained. Their friends were buried in the same ocean that had witnessed their triumph. In the years that followed, the world remembered the bombers, the battleships, and the generals. Few remembered the men who had waited in the dark, reshaping history through persistence. They did not ask to be remembered. The ocean had already done that for them. When the war ended, the submarines surfaced into peace, not for applause, but to breathe. Their work was done. Their silence had spoken. In the aftermath of victory, the oceans that had once raged with war grew still again. Beneath those waters lay wreckage, steel hulls, broken pride, and lessons written in salt. For both nations, the Pacific had become not just a battlefield, but a teacher. The Americans entered the war with machines built on confidence and theories. Their torpedoes, designed by laboratories and approved by bureaucracy, failed them. It was not technology that won the submarine war. It was the men who refused to accept failure. In the heat of patrol rooms and the cold silence of the depths, engineers and sailors reimagined their craft with the most human of tools: persistence. Every malfunction became a question. Every lost patrol, a hard-won answer. The Mark 14 torpedo, once a symbol of arrogance, was transformed through fieldwork and defiance into the weapon it was meant to be. And in that transformation, the U.S. Navy rediscovered an old truth: Wars are not won by systems, but by people willing to correct them. Japan never made that correction. Its admirals had built their doctrine on faith, faith in superiority, in the idea that discipline could substitute for innovation. Their fleets were perfect for 1941 and obsolete by 1943. They had studied victory, not adaptation. When the sea began to turn against them, they did not learn. They blamed fortune, not failure. In that difference lay the heart of the Pacific War. One side trusted tradition, the other trusted experiment. One clung to pride, the other to progress. The result was decided not by size or strength, but by the humility to admit a mistake and fix it before it was too late. The ocean, vast and indifferent, had served as the final instructor. It rewarded those who listened and destroyed those who did not. Every depth charge that shook an American submarine taught its crew a rule of survival, a new tactic, a better method. The very danger that sought to destroy them instead made them invincible. In the quiet years that followed, the lessons of the silent service shaped an entire generation of naval thought. Submarine warfare became not just a strategy, but a philosophy. Stay hidden, stay adaptable, strike only when certain. The post-war fleet, armed with nuclear power and guided missiles, carried within it the same discipline born in the cramped steel rooms of 1943. Yet the moral lesson lingered beyond tactics. The war beneath the waves revealed that innovation is not a luxury of victory. It is its price. When pride drowns out reflection, defeat follows. The Japanese admirals who once laughed at American toys had discovered this truth too late. By the end, the Pacific was littered with the evidence of both arrogance and evolution. The difference between them was simple. One learned, the other sank. In the deep, the ocean had taught humanity's oldest lesson once more. Those who refuse to change are buried by those who do. In 1941, when the Pacific was young with war, Japanese admirals laughed. They called the American submarine fleet slow, clumsy, blind. They believed victory would belong to those who struck first and loudest. In Tokyo's naval offices, the sea was theirs, a mirror to reflect their confidence. The Americans, they said, would never master its depths, but the ocean remembers what pride forgets. By 1945, the laughter had vanished, replaced by silence, the kind that follows loss too vast to count. The empire that had once sailed in endless convoys now looked out over empty water. Oil tankers no longer came home. Merchant ships no longer answered. The arteries of empire had been cut, one torpedo at a time, by the very submarines once dismissed as toys. Japan's admirals had prepared for the battleship era, not for the age of invisibility. Their fleets trained for thunder, not silence. They built vessels of grandeur, armed with heavy guns and ceremonial pride, while the Americans built patience. Below the surface, crews lived and died unseen, men whose only glory was measured in the tonnage of what disappeared. It was not strength that broke the empire, but precision. Not fury, but method. The Americans did not need to outfight their enemy. They only needed to outlast him. Where Japan trusted destiny, America trusted correction. Where one sought honor, the other sought results. In the end, the difference was survival. The submarines were not flawless machines. They were flawed miracles made effective by human will. Their crews fought more than the enemy. They fought pressure, fear, and the endless silence of the deep. Each patrol demanded composure, each dive a prayer. Yet from those steel tubes, patience became a weapon sharper than any blade. By 1945, Japan's empire had ceased to move. Cities starved in darkness, ships rotted in harbors. Airfields fell quiet for lack of fuel. The empire had been defeated not by invasion or atomic fire, but by subtraction, a slow, invisible erasure carried out beneath the waves. Even after the surrender, few understood the scale of what had been done. Historians would later calculate that 2% of the US Navy had destroyed half of Japan's wartime shipping. The submarines had done in silence what armies could never do in spectacle. Their victory was mathematical, inevitable, and absolute. For the men who fought that hidden war, there were no parades. They returned home quietly, carrying the weight of comrades who never surfaced. Their victory was not the kind that could be celebrated, only remembered. Beneath their calm discipline lay the knowledge that the ocean had taken its due. And yet, among those who survived, there was no arrogance. They had seen too much of what pride could destroy. They understood that victory had come not from superiority, but from adaptation, from the courage to change when everything was failing. In that sense, their true triumph was not over Japan, but over themselves. In Tokyo's post-war ruins, the surviving admirals faced the irony history had written for them. The enemy they once mocked had defeated them not through fire, but through thought, through the unglamorous strength of correction, the discipline of patience. Pride had measured power by speed and spectacle. History measured it by endurance. In the end, the empire had drowned in its own certainty. The laughter of 1941 had become the silence of 1945. Beneath the waves, arrogance met its quiet destroyer. They laughed once, they never laughed again.